Hour left, and we're pleased to have Lucien Smith, attorney and former chairman of the Mississippi GOP and part-time SuperTalk radio host as well.
That's right. That's right. It's good to be here with you. I was telling Gerard off the air, it's nice to come in when you don't have to worry about producing 3 hours of content. It's like, if I get boring, Gerard will just say, look, we're turn something else, I'll shut my mic off, and I can go home. So it's nice to come in that way.
Having done it, you appreciate those that have done this as a professional career. They're really special. They're pretty good at that. Paul obviously is very good. JT was awesome as well. Much respect for those.
Absolutely. And I don't think people realize how much time goes into getting ready for this, that it's not as simple as you come in, flip the mic on, go for 3 hours, turn it off, and go home. I mean, to produce the quality content y'all do, you've got to be working at least an hour for every hour you're on the air, and probably more than that to get
Yeah, no doubt. And I think you and I, we've always had a voracious appetite for information and data, right. But it's just, okay, well, normally I just read it, consume it, and kind of think, how does that maybe affect my life? Now it's like, no, I got to be able to talk about that. True. So it's a little different responsibility there. But, man, we were just talking in the hall there. We got a whole lot of stuff going on. I'm going to pass this on real quickly to the audience. We got the Dow down off its lows of the session. It's down 150. It's been down to 54, which means it shed a lot of its losses. But here's the big news coming out today that is affecting your wallets and affecting the markets. Two reports. One is that consumer spending is down, and polls point to further economic slowdown. I think the latest consumer sentiment index is like the lowest it's been in 50 years. And the other data point is that inflation remained a bit elevated in May, and so investors didn't see what they were hoping to see, which is maybe we're over this inflation hump, and that will maybe cause the Fed to stand down and not tip us into a recession. So those are kind of all the sausages going into the economy right now. It's important because it affects what you're paying at the pump, affects what you pay at the grocery store, it affects your prospects for a raise and jobs. And the good news on the mortgage front is I just saw the 10 years down 10 basis points today. It's down a lot.
That's good. Still in the fours, isn't it?
No, mortgages. I'm talking about the T-bill, which is down below 3, the 10 years, down below 3. It hadn't been there in a while. So I think we are going to see mortgage rates, they're already declining, come down even more. So that's it's a bit of good news, I think, for those that are seeking to take out a mortgage and buy a house. But, all right, first of all, we had a big election day here in the state of Mississippi Tuesday. We had 3 contested races, 3 congressional districts, which had runoffs on the Republican side. We had Congressional District 2, of course, which is the seat held by who seems like a permanent fixture up there is Benny Thompson, been there since 93.
Wow.
Democrat, represents Congressional District 2. Brian Flowers and Ron Eller advanced to a runoff there. Mr. Flowers prevailed, and he will face Congressman Thompson in the fall.
And he was the nominee back in 2020. So
that's right.
I assume started with a not insignificant advantage just because people knew him. And Brian seems like a decent guy. I met him a few times when I was chairman and he was running. And that's as you know, an uphill battle in the second. But I'm hopeful he'll be a good candidate. At the very least, force Congressman Thompson to have to work for it this time.
Hope so. I'm with you on that. And in CD3, an incredibly contentious race between Congressman Michael Guest and his challenger. He had 2 in the primary. Thomas Griffin and Michael Cassidy. Mr. Griffin was eliminated, so Mr. Cassidy advanced. Mr. Cassidy actually got about 400 more votes, I believe, on June the 7th than did the congressman. But what a change Tuesday in that race.
That one really was fascinating to watch because in a lot of ways, I don't know that presumably the Guest campaign had a sense of it, but I don't think regular folks realized Michael Guest had a race that day.
I agree.
Just anecdotally, I've talked to a lot of people, some of them, casual political observers, some of them people I think of as being very, very engaged in politics, both as consumers and sometimes people who are literal operators. who didn't vote that day, not because they had some problem with Michael Guest, but it's the same get out the vote conversation we have all the time. You got to get kids to school and camp and sports, and you got your job, and life happens. And I think there were a lot of people who got to 6 o'clock that day and just said, I'm home. Michael Guest has this.
Yeah.
And you kind of see it in the results. Cassidy got within 1,000 votes of what he got on the first election. He was in the 22,000s both times. Michael more or less doubled his vote.
Sure
and
did.
I think what happened was Cassidy had hit his ceiling. All the people who wanted to vote the bums out, they showed up, and they were motivated to show up a second time. But Guest was able to go out to the people who normally would be voters who just forgot to show up and show up. And then the other thing I think the Guest campaign did a really good job of, Cassidy had been able to run this kind of generic race leading up to June 7th. He'd said, I'm the America First candidate.
Yeah.
Michael Guest, voted for some continuing resolutions that included bad things, and that was essentially it. But nobody knew anything about him.
Right.
And I think the Guest campaign in the runoff did a very effective job of really telling a story about Cassidy that turned voters off, and I think that, coupled with their get out the vote efforts, helped them win that race. But that, I think they did a very good job in the runoff.
Yeah, and I don't know if it means anything, but I was just checking again. Michael Cassidy received 400 fewer votes in the runoff than he did in the first election.
That's right.
I don't know if that's anything that indicates indicative of anything whatsoever, but I think it does say that he kind of tapped his base and his max in terms of support in the first election.
I think that's right.
Yeah, and of course there could be some absentees to come in. There's not going to change the outcome, but may change that number. And then we had in Congressional District 4, the Pine Belt, the Gulf Coast, we got Representative Stephen Palazzo, the incumbent, who faced a field of candidates in the first election on June the 7th. Bryce Wiggins, the senator, was in that one. Clay Wagner was in that one as well. Kedron Peterson, all candidates. Carl Boyenton.
It was a crowded field.
Yeah, it was a big field that were pursuing the seat held by the Representative Stephen Palazzo. And Mike Ezell, the sheriff of Jackson County, advanced to the runoff against the congressman, and he prevailed Tuesday.
Yeah, and I think Sheriff Ezell started really as the favorite once you got to the runoff because Congressman Palazzo, who I personally like, he only got a third of the vote on June 7th. So 2/3 of the people in his district, at least 2/3 of the Republican primary voters in his district, showed up and chose to vote somebody else. And when that happens after somebody's been in office for a decade, that speaks to a political problem, that folks are showing up, they know you, and they're choosing to vote for somebody else. I think Stephen did a good job getting to 46% in the runoff. I mean, he was able to cut into the voters for some of the other candidates pretty effectively. But at the end of the day, I think Ezell just started with a real advantage there. And
certainly it didn't hurt him that some of the others who were eliminated in the first election threw their support behind the sheriff.
Yeah, the fact that he was able that quickly to get that much support, I think he got endorsed by all the other candidates.
I believe that's right.
And that's a pretty strong thing going into a runoff election.
It just feels like, Lucien, that there's a fairly active anti-incumbent sentiment sweeping not just Mississippi but the country. And I'll share this thought with you and let you react. The folks aren't happy. We just talked about the NORC poll, the AP NORC poll, showing that 85% of the country ain't happy with the direction it's going. And so I think there's this tendency to think, well, let's just get rid of all of them, Republican, Democrat, throw all the bums out. And it feels like that the Republicans maybe are paying a bit of a price, seated Republicans, for the failures of the Democrats.
Yeah, I think that's right. I think that's exactly right. And, Congressman Palazzo had it 20 years ago would have been a real asset, and it proved to be a liability for him. He had been in office for 10 years, so he's got some seniority. He's on the Appropriations Committee. Yep. 20 years ago, it would have been and certainly 30, 40 years ago, it would have been a compelling argument in that runoff to say, look, I'm getting seniority on appropriations. I'm going to be able to bring more money back to Mississippi if you reelect me than sending a freshman who's going to have to wait a decade to be able to do what I can do if you keep sending me up there. Well, that used to be a great argument. Nowadays, people go, I'm sick of people like you sitting up in office for that long, and I'm going to vote against you just because of it.
And don't really care about your seniority and your committee assignments and your levels on those committees. It doesn't seem to factor into it
That's
anymore.
right.
We got a break right here. We got Lucien Smith in the Element Wealth Studios. We're talking some politics. We got some other stuff to talk about, too. This abortion case, we'll get to that as well. Mississippi. So on the C Spire text line, I'm not sure what Jack and Jacktown's saying here, Rhino. Seems wonky. CDs were changed between primary and runoff. My coworker was in guest primary in Thompson runoff. What does that mean?
I've heard some of that anecdotally, that people showed up at a polling. This is the first election we've had since congressional redistricting after the 2020 census, and so there are some people who were not in. They may have been in just to use the second and third, because this is what happened in Jackson. You had people who used to be in the third congressional district who showed up to vote, and they were in the second.
I see. And
I've heard anecdotally that there were some people who showed up to vote on the 28th, and on the 7th they said, you're in the second, and then they came back and said, well, you're in the third.
Oh, man.
I hadn't independently verified it. I don't know if that's true, but I suspect that's what they're referring to.
I got you. That makes sense.
But I'll say this, as somebody who is, the Republican Party, we run the primary. I'm not the chairman now, so it was nice to have a primary where I woke up and thought, this isn't my problem today.
Yeah.
But you do, in almost every election, you're going to see a small amount of error, because at the end of the day, humans do this, volunteers do this.
Yeah.
And so you're going to see somebody, and it would happen. It happened every primary when I was chairman. There would be some precinct, and normally it was just one, where at 7:30 somebody would call and say, we showed up at the Woodgates precinct and it's not open. And you'd have to get the local chairman on the phone, figure out what was wrong, open it up. And then you also rely on, at least in Hinds County, you rely on the election commission to print the actual ballots that are used. And so if they screw up and put second congressional district ballots in the precinct box, somebody's got to fix that once that gets recognized. And so the good news is when the election difference is as big as it was on the second, those sorts of errors didn't affect the outcome. But as a voter, not everybody can come back to the polling place 3 times until it gets corrected. And so it's disappointing if anybody wasn't able to cast the vote that they wanted to cast, because that's their right as citizens.
It brings up another point and an opinion I've shared quite a bit with respect to election, not so much integrity, but accuracy. I think integrity maybe suggests that there's some sort of nefarious activity. I don't really mean this, but with respect to accuracy and truing the vote, the fact is there is a lot of manual intervention and manual activity. We're talking about from the registration to the roll maintenance to the polling place and the precincts. Right. I mean, all the way to the final tabulation. When you got that much human work and effort involved in it, you're just subject to have an error. Not an intentional error, just an inadvertent error.
That's
like
right.
that. And so the results are inaccurate, which don't matter unless it's really close.
That's 100% right. There is always going to be some error. And, you want to get it as close to zero as possible. It's the reason that I think it's important that voting machines should have a paper record so that you're able to go back and say with 100% confidence that it was counted correctly.
Sure.
But I think it's one of the reasons that this notion that the 2020 presidential election was stolen has stuck around, because you have the media, at least the mainstream media, continues to say there were no problems in the 2020 election. It was perfect. It was pristine. And there were problems.
Yeah, of course.
Were they problems big enough to change the result? That's a different question. But for the media to sit there and say nothing went wrong in 2020, I think people just know they're getting lied to, and that allows them to believe whatever.
Well, so I've always felt like with respect to 2020, it's somewhere between it was pristine and the whole thing was rigged. It's somewhere in between that,
I think that's right. I think that's right. And I think it's legitimate to ask questions
Absolutely
about it.
Absolutely it is. And there's all sorts of reports. I'm not sure if you've seen this or not, Lucien, where FBI and justice and law enforcement are running around confiscating property, and about Peter Navarro getting locked up. I mean, it looks like that maybe we're overstepping the due process laws in our country, and it's all because they don't support Joe Biden. I mean, you hate to think that we have sort of politics behind the scenes at play here, but it is something to be concerned about. All right, this abortion case. We just had on Attorney General Lynn Fitch. It is, honestly, it's thrust the state of Mississippi, the name Dobbs, into the spotlight, the Attorney General herself. And we got, as the General just said, we got what we asked for. Now we got a lot of work to do.
That's right.
But from a legal perspective, let's talk about that for a second, if you can. Are you familiar with this old 1998 Fordyce case and how that might come into play here?
Yeah, let me first say, I just want to commend General Fitch for what she did. I mean, it would have been easier for her to stick to the original reason that the petition was granted by the Supreme Court, to not go all the way for this. And she took an immense political risk, because I guarantee you, had the Supreme Court not overturned Roe versus Wade, there would be somebody sitting here. I'm not talking about me. There would be a person talking to you about how they were running against her for Attorney General next year.
You're right.
And it took a lot of courage to do what she did, and she ought to be commended for it, because the country's a better place for it. I have read the Fordyce decision, and here's the gist of it in a nutshell. The Mississippi Supreme Court in 1998 held that the Mississippi Constitution includes a right to an abortion. The Article 32 of the Mississippi Constitution, which is the last article in our state Bill of Rights, says just because a right's not listed, essentially, this isn't the exact language, but just because a right's not listed doesn't mean that the right doesn't exist, because that was one of the concerns in any of these bills of rights, that if you enumerated them, somebody would come back later and say, well, they didn't list it, and so it's no longer there. So in 98, the court took an old opinion where the Mississippi Supreme Court had said that Article 32 includes a right to privacy, and then they extended it in this Fordyce case to say the right to privacy includes a right to have an abortion. And they were very explicit in that opinion that that wasn't based on an explicit mention in the Constitution of a right to abortion. This was just them making the decision that right to privacy, which was also not explicitly mentioned in the Constitution, included a right to an abortion. So practically where we are on it, the fact that the U.S. Supreme Court has overturned Roe, which means there's no longer a federal constitutional right to an abortion, doesn't affect the 98 decision in Fordyce, because only, and this is something that, even though I don't like the result in the short term, as conservatives, we don't want the U.S. Supreme Court telling us what our Constitution says.
Sure.
So currently, our Constitution, as it's been interpreted, includes a right to an abortion. Now, there's a very different court, our Supreme Court, than there was 24 years ago.
Yeah.
And I think if you look at the analysis that was done in Fordyce, it's very reminiscent of Roe and Casey. It's these sort of emanations from penumbras, and it doesn't. And the biggest reason I think it fails, I mean, I'm a believer in an originalist approach to constitutional text. You should ask yourself, what did these people mean when this was originally adopted? And when the 1894 Constitution was adopted, Mississippi had a criminal statute prohibiting abortion.
Okay.
So now it had a quickening exception. So pre-quickening abortions were permissible. But the idea that the same people who had a law prohibiting some abortions passed a constitutional amendment, or passed a constitution that included a right to abortion, I think when you get some of the originalists on the court revisiting it, they're going to ultimately overturn it. But here's what will happen practically. The Chief Justice has to appoint a special chancellor.
Just talking to the general about that before she left. She's waiting for that appointment. Hasn't happened yet.
But I think that'll come anytime.
Yep.
And that chancellor is going to enjoin, this is my prediction, the chancellor is going to enjoin Mississippi's trigger law, because a lower court judge is bound by the precedent of a superior court. They cannot overturn that opinion. Now, they may say the Mississippi Supreme Court may revisit this, but they're going to enjoin it. It's going to go up on appeal to the Mississippi Supreme Court, and then I think there's a high likelihood that the Supreme Court will overturn it. Now, I'll say one other thing on this. Yeah. One of the big differences between the Mississippi Constitution and the U.S. Constitution is the U.S. Constitution is very, very difficult to amend. The Mississippi Constitution is not very, very difficult to amend, or at least it's not as difficult as the U.S. Constitution.
Sure.
So I think it's conceivable you could see the legislature, if the court hasn't taken care of it sooner, put a constitutional amendment on the ballot in 23 that clearly removes any constitutional right to an abortion.
So let's review that. I believe the standard to amend the U.S. Constitution is 2/3 of the Congress and 3/4 of the state. Is that right?
That's right.
Okay.
And very difficult to get.
At the state, the legislature can pass an amendment, right, in the legislature, referring it to the ballot, and then the people go to the ballot box to ratify it, to vote on it.
That's right.
And so it's popular. I mean, a majority vote at that point.
That's my recollection of how that works, and that's that's not simple. It's not as easy as passing a law.
But not like getting 3/4 of the states.
But it's not like getting 3/4 of the states to agree to a constitutional provision.
We can't get 3/4 of the states to agree on how many genders there are. So
that's exactly right.
You can hang around?
Yeah, absolutely.
All right. So pro-choice, just want to get this out, is pro-choice Mississippi was the plaintiff, was the name of in this 1998 case. And it is at the heart of the case that's being filed right now that we're waiting on the chancellor on, right?
That's right. They're the plaintiff.
We got Lucien Smith in the studio. The One Mississippi song that Steve authored, of course, and composed, and really excited. Happened to be present for that signing, and that was just so fantastic. He was just so humble and honored about it, and a great group of folks.
Well, it's a great song.
It's a great song,
pleasant
too.
to listen to.
Yeah, I agree. So he's so talented in that respect. Before I ask you about the Ninth Amendment,
sure.
Okay, ask Lucien if the Republicans are going to make a very big push to beat Benny Thompson. He needs to go. It's a good question. I'll just say this first. If you look at the turnout on the Democrat side and the Republican side in the primary, which I think is a pretty good indicator of what the general may look like, I'm not sure any amount of money can overcome that.
Yeah, I've not talked to Chairman Bordeaux specifically about the 2nd Congressional District and what their plans are. I mean, what the party normally does is they'll provide the candidate access to data. They'll provide access to the lists to help raise money and get volunteers. We've got a network of volunteers through the Delta, and I agree 100% unambiguously we would be better off with Congressman Thompson. We're not there. He needs to go. But unfortunately, that is a district that is extremely difficult for Republicans to win.
Yeah.
And I've seen us run great campaigns there. I've seen us run lousy campaigns there. I've seen us run great candidates there. I've seen us run lousy candidates there. And unfortunately, there's a very similar result. So nothing would make me happier than to see Brian Flowers represent the 2nd Congressional District. And I hope that the party, and I suspect that the party is doing everything in its power to beat Congressman Thompson. But you're just, you're starting that's just a very, very difficult district to win.
It is. And of course, to some extent, as you well know, it's drawn that way. I mean, it's drawn to favor Democrat candidate.
It
just is.
It's a very Democratic district. I hope we can continue to make inroads in the African American community so that having a majority-minority district doesn't necessarily guarantee the election of a Democrat. But that is a long-term task for the Republican Party that I think we're doing a good job at. I think Donald Trump helped with, but we're a long way away from victory there.
I'm hearing more feedback. I will say this, just anecdotally, from traditional Democrat voters, including black voters in Mississippi, who say, you know what, I'm not voting for that again. I mean, you can't escape the cost of gas. You can't escape the cost of groceries. You can't. I just got my power bill. That's the biggest power bill I've ever had. I don't know if you've seen your power bill, but it's through the roof.
Yes, I completely agree.
Unbelievable. So everybody is having to pay for the staples of life. They're all affected. And like it or not, and whether the president is personally responsible, we just hang that on the president.
Right.
We just do, good or bad. That's just the way it works here.
That's right. And we're seeing, I mean, we are making huge inroads in minority communities. You saw it somewhat in the 2020 election, but you're continuing to see in polling a lot of Hispanics, African Americans, people who historically might have identified as a Democrat, looking at this and saying, the Democratic policies are affecting my life in a negative way, and so on. That's why I think it's so important. We've got to stick to the core message, keep the main thing, talk about the way bad Democratic policy has negatively affected people's lives economically. And if we do that, I think we're going to have a good November.
Well, and certainly a positive indicator was the seating of Congresswoman Flores in Texas, in a district that hasn't had a Republican in over 100 years. I heard a great interview with her this morning. What are you hearing from your constituents? Every one of them said it's inflation, it's the price of gas. Well, duh, because every poll suggests that as well.
That's right.
So she heard that and she said, I'm going to work to change these policies and to be part of a majority coming in and hopefully a Republican president so we can undo a lot of this stuff.
That's right.
It's the only way we're going to move the needle. And my concern is, Lucien, from a political perspective, let's say we flip the House. Maybe we're fortunate and we get a seat or two advantage in the Senate. Still fairly limited on what we can do, and whatever problems we have right now with respect to the economy, we're limited.
We are, because so much of that does get controlled by the executive branch, and so much of it's already happened, right? I mean, we overspent, we put too much money out there, and that is caused, at least in part, that's been a significant driver of inflation. So it's not going to be as simple as a new Congress coming in and instantly fixing it, but we cannot exacerbate it. We can try to hold the Biden administration accountable, and hopefully we can have a good, consistent message so that in 24 we end up with a Republican-controlled Congress and a Republican in the White House, which can't solve every problem on day one, but would be a good first step to heading in the right direction, I think.
And what I hope is that the private sector says, okay, gridlock, let me go make some investments, let me go do some hiring, let me go plan for the future, because right now it's hunker down, what the heck's coming next?
That's
I know sitting in that chair is the way it usually it works. All right, let's talk about the Ninth Amendment. Now, this is one that doesn't get a lot of attention. You heard the First Amendment, the Second Amendment, the 10th Amendment. I would argue maybe get more attention than any from a wouldn't you say?
Yeah.
But the Ninth is one that doesn't, and so that is now kind of popping up as something that might have some legs with respect to this abortion debate. The Ninth Amendment essentially states that the federal government doesn't own the rights that are not listed in the Constitution. Instead, they belong to the people. It's a little vague to me, honestly. It's not real explicit, but how could this come into play with this abortion case?
So my understanding of the history of the Ninth Amendment is that there were some of the Founding Fathers who were opposed, and I'm ashamed I can't remember which one in particular, but there was a driver of it, they were concerned that by having a Bill of Rights, they were opposed to the Bill of Rights because the fear was not that the rights were bad. The fear was if we put together a list of these specific rights, that later that'll be used to say, well, it wasn't one of the rights that was in the Bill of Rights, so you don't have it. And so the Ninth Amendment was intended to be this catch-all where they said, just because we didn't write it down in these first 10 doesn't mean the right exists. And so there's not a ton of jurisprudence about the Ninth Amendment, in large part because they've used substantive due process to enlarge these sort of nebulous invented rights. But I think the U.S. Supreme Court, with its current composition, would be unlikely to find some right to abortion in the Ninth Amendment, because I think they would probably treat it very similarly to the way Alito handled substantive due process in the Dobbs case. Yeah. To essentially say that this right is out there, it has to be deeply, and I forget the exact wording, it has to be, but essentially deeply embedded in the history and tradition of our country. So if you can go back and say in 1789 or 1814 or 1860, whenever the specific amendment happened to be adopted, that this was a right, well then, okay, maybe that was a right that existed. Okay. But if you don't do, and the reason I and a lot of conservatives prefer that kind of originalist interpretation is unless you say, what did they mean in 1789? It's not saying the laws ought to be the same as they were then. No, in a lot of cases, they absolutely shouldn't be. But if you allow 5 members of the Supreme Court to say, well, the Ninth Amendment creates a right for X, Y, and Z, it's just their policy preferences. I'd love to see a right in the Constitution to school choice. I think that'd be great. But I don't want 5 unelected judges in D.C. saying, you know what, we've looked at the Ninth Amendment, and even though there was no concept of school choice when the Ninth Amendment was adopted, we've decided you have to have school choice everywhere in the Constitution.
That's mandates it. Yeah, it's almost you could compare it to the concept of federalism, where the Constitution basically says, hey, if it's not a power specifically enumerated in the Constitution and delegated to the federal government, it goes to the states.
Exactly.
It's kind of the same. This is sort of the equivalent for rights as opposed to powers.
That's right. Yeah. But on the powers point, that's why I think this whole idea you're going to codify Roe by the Congress, I don't think Congress has the power to.
Well, I wondered that as well. And I've read a number of reports on that, what that means to codify, but really that they can just – the fundamental problem here, and I know you realize this, is that we cannot agree whether or not that baby in the womb has a right to life. Right? I mean, that's the fundamental at the core of this argument.
Well, and it's the reason it's the core problem with Roe, right? Because this is ultimately, I mean, I believe that that life begins at conception, but these are the sort of moral decisions that are hard for judges to make, but far better for elected representatives to make, because the people have the ability to say, I disagree with you on that decision. I'm going to vote you out and send somebody who makes a different choice. But Roe and Casey took that away from the people. Right. And I think it's the reason that abortion is so controversial in the U.S., whereas when you go to other countries, their laws are it's not this massive political issue that it is here.
Makes perfect sense. This is why I take exception with those who say it's the end of democracy. No, in fact, this is really reaffirming democracy.
That's the craziest talking point. We're going to let voters decide, so our democracy has ended.
Oh, my gosh. Lucien, always a pleasure, sir. Hey, thanks for coming in the Element Wealth Studios. Yep, Lucien Smith, attorney and former chairman of the Mississippi GOP. Another segment on Middays. We're coming right